I'm welcoming back my guest today, Justin Glaw, who's Rolling Stone reporting about 70 election officials across the country having expressed election denialism, made national headlines over the last few weeks. We've got a few big updates here out of Georgia in particular, which has been ground zero of this entire fight. Justin, what rule did the Georgia State Election Board just pass?
Last week, they passed another rule that gives more powers to local election officials in Georgia's 159 counties to refuse or delay or deny certification of election results. And quickly, what it does is that it allows them to compare ballots cast with the number of voters in any precinct. And if those numbers don't add up, then they're allowed to sort of say, well, something doesn't look right here, and they can deny certification. The reason why those numbers often don't add up is really just a matter of routine errors and miscalculations on the part of voting machines. So while you would think that those numbers would always add up, it's a pretty regular occurrence that they don't. So this just gives them one more way to say, nope, we're not going to certify these results.
Okay, now Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, he actually weighed in here. He's asking the Georgia Attorney General for guidance on whether he can actually remove members of the state election board. Is that the direct result of these members basically acquiescing to Donald Trump's demands by voting in favor of these rules to deny certification, really with no evidence at all?
A slightly indirect result of that, because, what has happened in the last few weeks since really what started this was, Trump's rally in Atlanta on August 3rd, where he called out and praised three members of the state election board. And, so that was bad enough in itself, right? These are unelected, appointed officials who are supposed to be sort of neutral arbiters of election rules and investigations in Georgia. If that wasn't enough, then they went on to pass rules that have been pushed by election denial activists throughout the state. And as a result of that, Democrats and voting rights groups have said, hey, these people got to go. And then, of course, there was the small matter of my reporting that one of the members, these pro-Trump members of the election board, sought a Trump administration post in the EPA at some point amid all of this. So as a result of all of that, people have said, these people got to go. And now the news today is that Kemp has said, look, I'm going to check with the Attorney General to see if I have the power to remove these, again, appointed non-elected officials. The same Democrats and voting rights groups who are calling for their removal, they say, look, our reading of the law says you absolutely have the power to do that, and you should do that.
I'm curious here, your reporting obviously made huge waves across the country. I'm curious whether that has had the impact of kind of having these people take a step back and slowing their roll a little bit, kind of like how they've been caught, like there's been a sense of sunlight being the best disinfectant, or whether that's just made them double down because, I mean, you just spoken about the fact that they've passed yet another rule. So it kind of would give the indication that even though more and more people are paying attention to this, far from taking a step back, they're actually doubling down on what they're doing.
Yeah, well, there's sort of two camps to consider here in Georgia when you think about election officials, and one is these three members of this SEB, and to answer your question, there's no indication that any of this reporting or any of this sunlight or any of this focus and attention has made them rethink their efforts.
Yeah.
These are committed election denial activists. And they are pro-Trump people who they believe fervently that the 2020 election was stolen. They believe in widespread election fraud. They believe that they are working towards what they would call election integrity. And they are not going to change that path, really for anyone, unless, maybe Kemp removes them, or probably what's going to happen, as was alluded to today by Democrats who held a press conference at the state capitol, is that they are going to probably get sued. And, that might make them reflect upon their decisions. The other camp here of election officials in Georgia that is maybe perhaps starting to have that moment of reflection a little bit are all of the county election board members who work in all the various counties who are election deniers, of which there are at least 20 across the state. And these are the people who now have more power to deny certification. And just, I guess, kind of behind the scenes here is that some of my reporting is bearing out that maybe some of these people are starting to feel the pressure that they're not allowed to do that. And they're maybe starting to consider that.
This might be too in the weeds here or too on the legal end here, in which case I could also ask Mark Elias, who
Sure.
you have a good relationship with. But I guess the question here is, do any of these state or county election officials have any legal exposure if they do use their positions to kind of perpetuate their political agenda as opposed to just treating their positions as what they are, which is just ministerial?
Yeah, certainly in Georgia and elsewhere, there are legal remedies to not only try to get local election officials in the state of in the case of Georgia, county election board members to do their jobs of certifying results, but there are also legal penalties that can result from them not doing that. And so, what we've seen in Georgia and elsewhere, this concept of using writs of mandamus has really taken hold. That when these refusals to certify take place, Democrats and aligned lawyers and voting rights groups, and in some states even private citizens can file writs of mandamus, demanding that a court essentially force local election officials to do their job and certify results. In the case of a couple of these officials in Arizona, they've also been sued by, I think, the Secretary of State over there, and are now facing criminal charges. I think one of them was just convicted of this. So there are legal consequences for refusing certification. For the members of the Georgia State Election Board, I think it remains to be seen what kind of legal exposure they could have. But certainly it is very possible that what we are witnessing right now is the next election interference RICO case that could be brought by someone like the case that's happening, that's sort of on hold in Fulton County with Bonnie Willis, because these appear to be pretty coordinated efforts across the board with all sorts of officials, county election officials, state election board members, members of the Georgia Republican Party, members of the Republican National Committee, that are all working together to implement rules and policies that benefit the Trump campaign. So,
I mean, you've literally got Donald Trump himself on stage broadcasting his strategy, his instructions to these Georgia state election board members, who will then go and follow those directions only a few days later. I mean, there's this sense that if you commit criminal activity, corrupt activity in broad daylight, that somehow it makes it less corrupt. But that I don't think that's going to carry any water.
Yeah, and look, all members of these boards, whether it's the state election board or county election boards, they're political appointees, right? So we know that Republicans are going to tend to focus on what they call election integrity. We know that Democrats are going to tend to focus on what they call voting rights, right? What's different about this potentially, and I guess more to your point, legally speaking, is that this is now, I think, becoming more obvious that this is a top-down strategy, or maybe it's a decentralized strategy that everybody's just in agreement, from Trump to the RNC to the Georgia GOP to the state election board, that these are the policies and the rules that we need to be pursuing to make sure that there's no voter fraud, as they call it.
Right.
But yes, saying these things out loud does seem like an odd way to not tell people that this is all coordinated.
Right. Never would have expected this from the guy who got on a phone call with plenty of other people on the phone and said, "Can you find us 11,780 votes?"
Right.
Really blows my mind there. Justin, do you have any indication as to where the Georgia Attorney General stands? Because if Brian Kemp is kind of sounding the alarm here and asking him whether or not it's appropriate to remove certain board members, it's reasonable to infer that Brian Kemp might be against this rule, but how MAGA or not MAGA is the Attorney General of Georgia, Christopher Carr?
Well, I think what has happened with Kemp asking for his opinion on this matter is very interesting. Because like I said, the Democrats and voting rights advocates say that the law is pretty clear in that Kemp absolutely does have the power to remove these people. And by remove, I don't mean immediately. He has to have administrative hearings. The members in question have to have 30 days notice and all of this stuff. But the fact that he's sort of punting this to Chris Carr is very interesting, because now he's sort of putting the onus on Carr to make this what is going to be a very controversial decision
Right.
in Georgia. Because look, there's a lot of people who are sort of Kempian Republicans who aren't supportive of Trump and all of this election denier madness. And there are just as many, probably a lot more, that believe wholeheartedly in this stuff. So the fact that Kemp has kicked this to Carr is extremely interesting. And as far as Carr's background and motivation and all of this, let's not forget that it was just in the past few weeks that the same rogue members of this election board asked Chris Carr to reopen an investigation into double counted ballots in Fulton County in 2020 that has really been the white whale of the election denial movement here in terms of trying to prove widespread voter fraud. And Carr came back to him and said, no, I'm not going to investigate that. First off, you can't tell me what to do. You're not legally, it's not within your authority to demand an investigation from my office. And on top of that, this has already been investigated. Fulton County has been punished for these errors. These errors had no measurable effect on the outcome of the 2020 election. So if you take that and read between the lines of that, then I think it is possible, if not probable, that Carr will come back to Kemp in this instance and say, yeah, you've got the authority to remove these members. Go ahead. You have my blessing.
I mean, maybe I misread this a little bit, because if Brian Kemp was really against it and he knew that he had the authority, because most people would presume that the governor does have the authority to remove these members, by punting instead to the attorney general, isn't he giving himself some room to basically take the onus off of himself? And like, if he wanted to do it, he could. I mean, many people are saying that he has the authority to do it anyway. So couldn't one say that like this is a way for him to kind of get, to give the MAGA acolytes what they want without him being the bad guy?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's politically, it's a smart move on his part. I think there is also some legitimate legal questions here about whether or not he has the power to remove some of these officials, because I believe only one of them is a governor appointee. Rick Jeffries, the guy who I wrote about last week or whatever, that tried to solicit this EPA post in the Trump administration, he was approved by the Senate. The other two MAGA members of the state election board, I believe in some way, shape, or form, they were approved by the state legislature. So I think there is a legitimate legal question of whether or not Kemp has the authority to remove these people. But certainly punting the issue to Chris Carr, takes the weight of that decision off of Kemp. And he can now say, well, look, Chris Carr said yes or no or whatever he's going to say. And so it wasn't my decision. So he can sort of appease the more moderate Republicans who don't believe in all of this election denier insanity. And he can also say, I didn't make this call, for all the people who are in, Georgia Republican circles who do believe this stuff. They do want these people on the board. They do support these policies.
Now, it's the end of August. We are nearing dangerously close to November with this stuff all very much unresolved. Do you have any indication as to when it will be resolved?
And look, that's a really good question, because that is something that Democrats and voting rights people are starting to pick away at here. And indeed, you heard mentioned a lot by the lone Democrat on the board in the last meeting, which is that we are changing rules that will affect millions and millions of Georgia voters less than 90 days out from an election.
Yeah.
And not just rules about certification, but there have been rules passed that allow for more poll watchers in different areas where votes are being counted. And I think one of the things that was really honed in on by the lone Democrat on the board was rules that change physically what absentee and mail-in ballots look like. So in some cases, she was saying, counties have already started printing these. We're less than 90 days out from the election. And now all of a sudden we're going to create a bunch of new rules about what these things have to look like. This is sort of crazy here. Why are we implementing rules this close to an election? And that's to say nothing of the fact that most of these rules, when you watch these state election board meetings and when you read the petitions for the rules, the people behind them are hardcore election denial activists, right? That's where these rules are coming from.
Well, Justin, you've been like at the forefront of this beat. Where can we read more from you?
I write a Substack newsletter called American Doom, and the website is american-doom.com.
Okay, well, I'll put that link in the post description of this video. I'll also embed it right here on the screen. For those who are watching right now, please support the invaluable work that Justin is doing. He has been one of the most important voices on this entire topic, and I know that there's going to be a lot more to hear from about this stuff. So, Justin, we'll have you on again probably in the coming days or at least a week here as we get new news on this point. And thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks a lot, Brian.